He was still fighting a war that had already ended nearly 30 years ago. While the rest of the world rebuilt cities, invented new technologies, and moved on from one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, one man remained hidden deep inside a jungle, rifle in hand, convinced that the enemy was still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike. Every shadow was a threat, every sound could mean death, and every single day, he prepared to kill or be killed, completely unaware that the war he was risking his life for no longer existed. His name was Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese intelligence officer trained for one purpose: to survive, resist, and never surrender under any circumstances. At the height of World War II, when the Pacific Theater had become a brutal and unforgiving battlefield, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines with orders that would define the rest of his life. He was not to die, he was not to surrender, and he was not to stop fighting, no matter what happened. By the time American forces stormed the island in 1945, everything around him began to collapse with terrifying speed. Gunfire echoed through the jungle, explosions tore through the landscape, and soldiers fell one after another until Onoda found himself among the last survivors. With only 3 men remaining, he became the highest-ranking officer by default, and with that came a responsibility he would carry far beyond the end of the war itself. Outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off, they retreated into the mountains not to escape, but to continue the fight from the shadows. Hidden beneath thick jungle canopies, they built makeshift shelters from bamboo, lived off whatever they could find, and survived by adapting to one of the harshest environments imaginable. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually something strange began to happen. They started finding newspapers, pamphlets, and messages scattered across the island, all saying the same thing: Japan had surrendered. The war was over, but to Onoda, this wasn't relief, it was deception. He believed it was nothing more than an elaborate psychological trick designed by the enemy to force them out into the open. And so, instead of surrendering, he chose to believe something far more dangerous: that the war was still going on, and that he was one of the last soldiers still fighting it. That decision changed everything. While the rest of the world entered a new era, Onoda remained trapped in a reality that no longer existed, carrying out guerrilla attacks against local farmers, sabotaging crops, and striking without warning before disappearing back into the jungle like a ghost. To the people living on the island, he wasn't just a soldier anymore, he had become a legend, a shadowy figure that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly, leaving fear behind. Years passed, and the group slowly began to fall apart. In 1950, one of his men finally broke under the pressure and surrendered, stepping out of the jungle 5 years after the war had ended. The others stayed, still loyal, still convinced they were doing the right thing, but time was relentless. In 1954, another soldier was killed during a confrontation, leaving only 2 men behind. And even then, Onoda refused to consider the possibility that everything he believed might be wrong. Imagine living like that, not for months, not for years, but for decades. While entire generations were being born, growing up, and changing the world, he remained frozen in time, still mentally locked in 1945. He maintained his uniform, cleaned his rifle, and followed his orders with absolute discipline, as if his commanding officer could appear at any moment to inspect his work. To him, nothing had changed. The war was still real. The enemy was still out there, and surrender was never an option. By the 1960s, most people believed he was dead. The Japanese government had officially declared him gone, another casualty lost to the chaos of war. But deep in the jungle, Onoda continued to survive, adapting, enduring, and refusing to let go of the mission that had defined his existence. Then, in 1972, his last remaining companion was killed, leaving him completely alone for the first time in decades. 1 man, 1 weapon, and a war that existed only in his mind. For most people, that level of isolation would have broken them completely. But Onoda wasn't most people. If anything, being alone only strengthened his resolve. With no one left to question him, no one left to challenge his beliefs, he became even more certain that he was right and the rest of the world was wrong. He continued his routine, moving silently through the jungle, surviving off the land, and preparing for a conflict that had ended long ago. Then, in 1974, something happened that no one could have predicted. A young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki set out on what seemed like an impossible mission to find the soldier who refused to surrender. Against all odds, he succeeded. When the two finally met, it was like two completely different worlds colliding. Suzuki tried to explain everything: the war, the surrender, the decades that had passed, but Onoda wouldn't accept it. Not without direct orders, not without hearing it from the one person he trusted above all others, his commanding officer. So Suzuki returned to Japan and did something extraordinary. He found Onoda's former commander, now an old man living a completely normal life, far removed from the chaos of war. Together, they traveled back to the island to deliver the order that should have been given nearly 3 decades earlier. When they finally stood face to face, Onoda listened carefully, waiting for any sign that this might be another trick. But there was none. The order was real. The war was over. After 29 years of hiding, fighting, and surviving, Onoda finally lowered his weapon. The mission that had consumed his entire life had come to an end in a single moment. When he returned to Japan, he was greeted as a hero, a symbol of loyalty and discipline in a world that had changed beyond recognition. But adapting to that new world proved to be a challenge of its own. After spending nearly 3 decades in complete isolation, modern life felt overwhelming, almost alien. Eventually, he chose a quieter path, moving to Brazil to live as a farmer before returning to Japan years later to share his experiences and teach younger generations about resilience, discipline, and purpose. Hiroo Onoda passed away in 2014, but his story continues to fascinate people around the world, not just because of what he did, but because of what it represents. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about war, it's a story about belief, about how powerful the human mind can be when it fully commits to something, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It's a story that forces you to ask a difficult question. If you were in his place, cut off from the world, surrounded by uncertainty, and driven by orders you believed were absolute, would you have done anything differently? And more importantly, how long would you have lasted?